Hi, and welcome back to Literally Literary. If this is your first time joining us, be sure to check out our previous episodes. This episode, we will continue and conclude our discussion on The Hate U Give by Angie Thomas. My name is Vanessa, and this is Literally Literary, which is brought to you by the Mellon Foundation through the Humanities Collaborative at EPCC and UTEP.
So we're going to hit the ground running here because there's a lot of track to cover from what the film has to say about it. And also, if you joined us for the film screening, we're thinking now that we have an Instagram of having you guys ask us questions that we could address on the show. So kind of from where we left off, we were talking a little bit about going into the film, but one of the things that we don't get too much in the film is on page 64 and 65, where Ms. Rosalie talks a little more about Khalil's background. And so there's this passage here where she says, and so Ms. Rosalie is his grandmother, and she says, "He told me, Grandma, I can't stay in this. Mr. Maverick said it only leads to two things, the grave or prison, and I ain't trying to see either. He respected you, Maverick, a lot. You were the father he never had." And later on she says, "I know he remembered the things you told him over the years, Maverick, and that gave me a lot of faith." So I think this passage is important because it brings more roundness to Khalil's character, in that there's a stereotype of the young boy who gets into drugs and drug dealing, and all of a sudden that just excuses his murder in this case, and also that there's a stereotype that just because they're dealing drugs, automatically that makes them a bad person, right? Someone without any moral scruples. Right. But here with Miss Rosalie, it's not just the chemo that he was trying to help her with, but also we get from Miss Rosalie the insight that he was looking to Maverick actually for help, because Mav, of course, was a former King Lord, and did time for it. And it's one of those things where once you get caught up in the gang, it's hard to get out. Right. And so he was looking to him until, unfortunately, it was, of course, too late for that. But what did you guys think about getting some more background into Khalil and the way that he was, what happened with him?
Well, I think it's really important just because it all ties back into that whole idea of thug life and the conversation that Maverick and Star have earlier on, where it might be later on, they discuss what thug life meant and how it applies to their community there in Garden Heights.
Right, and kind of just speaking to the way the media covers Khalil's life is, you see it all too often as a flattened image, whereas, the reality is often very nuanced, and there's complicated reasons why people do get caught up in this kind of life, and never ever does it mean that they deserve any kind of thing that happens to them, and so I think that's a great kind of depth that the book allows that you can't exactly get in the film.
Yeah, and you also see the idea of Maverick as a father figure to him. And I think, of course, not having grown up with a father figure like him also is another thing to note about, why he ends up like this, right? He doesn't have that role model that Maverick is to Star. And this kind of also leads to another point about Maverick, right? And something that we don't see in the film. Yes. What was that, Vanessa?
So there's a character in the novel that doesn't appear in the film, and his name is DeVante, and he's another teen living in Garden Heights that kind of gets mixed up with the King Lords as well. So around page 172 is when we first see DeVante. I was gonna say Khalil. So DeVante is trying to kind of take shelter in the store, in Mav's store. And then when Maverick takes notice that he's trying to hide, he starts asking him who he's getting involved with. And then Maverick kind of decides that they need to help DeVante and in getting out of this situation as well. So Maverick kind of really sees this as a way to redeem himself and help DeVante in the ways that he wasn't able to help Khalil.
Yeah, and it's a powerful scene because we do get Maverick's exposition about, he says, I became a king lord when I was 12 on 175. Shit, that was the only way to survive. Somebody was always coming at me because of my pops, because his father was the OG, right? Adonis Carter. And so this is kind of that moment where the Maverick can act as the protector, both in this immediate scene of him seeking shelter, but also as just someone who can provide that positive example, right? Of like, what do you do in this kind of circumstance if you are getting caught up with either the King Lords in this case, or there's also the Garden Disciples, the rival gang that is not really mentioned in the
pretty much non-existent.
Yeah, in the film. Yeah. Why do you guys think DeVante then? I mean, he pretty much becomes, like you were saying, that he pretty much is subsumed into Seven, right? Like his traits and.
Yes, in the film, DeVante isn't there, but a lot of the things that happen in the novel to DeVante end up happening to Seven in the film. So one of the examples that I had was there's a scene where let me find it. I had it here. I guess I didn't. So there's a scene in the film where Kenya, Seven's half sister, texts Star saying, "Come get Seven, King beat him up." In the novel, it's DeVante that's actually beaten up by King for not having paid him back yet. Yeah. But I feel like it's very important for it to be the way it was written, because you do see that, I guess, you see more of the community in this way rather than King just being upset, coming home, and beating up Seven.
Yeah, like it's not.
Like there's more of a motive behind it.
Yeah, like it's no longer just something that's familial, right? It's just you see the impact that King has on the whole community, right? That he terrorizes the whole community through his, influence and
through the threat of violence.
The threat of violence. Yeah. In the case of DeVante, I mean, just someone who clearly is desperate and doesn't know where to go, right? And of course, when people get desperate, that's when unfortunately they get caught up in those kinds of things, and they don't have a way out. It reminds me a lot of this, just kind of riffing, but the Juarez violence. I mean, I related a lot to that, and a lot of people who in Juarez, which is right across the border from us, get caught up in drugs is the same reason. That we have what are called ninis, which are kids who are neither in school, nor in working. That's why they're called ninis, ni educación, ni trabajo, and it's the same thing. Because of the economy in Juarez, it's the only thing that they can find is to deal drugs for these cartels, act as lookouts, different things like that. There's a great film about it, by the way. If you're listening, I recommend that. That it's called Tigers Are Not Afraid, and it's kind of this magical realist look at kids and exposed to that kind of world. Um, but yeah, I mean, very reminiscent of all the things that are going on. As someone who grew up in Juarez, I mean, it's very reminiscent of that. You know, you kind of see them more as humans, you know, as lives that matter, and not just as people who end up just shot in the middle of the street.
Yeah. It's actually, yeah, a pretty apt comparison. You know, again, just thinking about how cultures of violence are perpetuated in a systemic way, and ways in which people maybe don't have a choice, any other choice but to maybe get involved in some way.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it becomes very easy to just draw a broad brush and, I mean, paint the whole thing as like, you know, this is like a corrupt society that doesn't care. I mean, it is very corrupt in Mexico, but a lot of it is also the lack of opportunity, the lack of educational resources, and the lack of, you know, a lot of things, access to basic resources in some cases. So after that opportunity for Maverick to kind of start grooming DeVante into someone that, you know, he can get out, right? He can help, just like, I think, well, actually the opposite of what his father was to him, right? Because his father got him caught up in that. After that whole ordeal, we still get, you know, the suspense and the media representation of the grand jury. But what else, Vanessa, was important when it comes to Williamson Prep and the whole time as this is going on with Star?
So a couple pages after we first see DeVante, we are back at Williamson, and Star's not really excited to be at school. And then she finds out that everyone is ditching school, kind of. Well, they're protesting, or they call it protesting.
The majority, right?
Yeah, right. And so everyone's skipping class, everyone's leaving to protest for Khalil. And this is another part where the novel actually is different from the film again, in the sense that in the film, Star also decides to leave school because everyone else has done it, and she ends up going home. But in the novel, she and a couple of her friends actually stay at school because they realize that a lot of the students aren't actually doing it for Khalil, they're just doing it to skip class.
Yeah, and one of the characters whom I don't think is in the film, but is here in the book, who I think adds kind of a nice, opposing view besides Star, who in the film does, of course, protest, right? So there's that, like, big confrontation with her and Haley. But here on that 186, Jess is an interesting character because, first of all, Jess is white, but she's consciously choosing to ditch the protest. So she's ditching the ditching, and she says, I don't use dead people to get out of class. And, Star says, if I wasn't straight, I would totally date her for saying that. And she also goes on to say, white people do stupid shit sometimes. And so I think it's a very strong way for someone who is white to act as an ally, when it comes to those kinds of things, because Star being pretty much the only black student there, I mean, it adds power to her own rationale, right, of how she sees this event as just this pretext, right? And for someone like Jess to speak up like that, it says a lot, in those kinds of moments, right, where you feel like you're the outsider, you feel like you're the one with you're gonna become the pariah. So I really like that at Jess, and she's mentioned there as a senior, and that Star wishes like she knew her more. But it just kind of drives the stakes more too, because you kind of get to think about standing up for something,
Yeah.
and not just the act of protest is sometimes taken for granted, but as a writer I think it is very important. And I myself, even though I'm an academic, I do think that it's important for all of us, regardless of your own background, to understand the importance of activism. And in the case of if you are an expert in some kind of field, to use that, leverage that. I mean, otherwise, like, what's the point if you're publishing articles and in journals and books, but you're not actually putting that into action, and you're keeping it behind these gates where other people can, the public in general, can access it.
Yeah.
And protest becomes a way to do that.
When you have a voice, power in any way, right? It is important to think about how you enact that, or how you even the decision to be apolitical is in a way a very political one, because it kind of inherently chooses the side of injustice through lack of decision. And so anyway, I like the way you brought up this characterization of maybe someone thinking a little bit more consciously on the issue, because it I think as overall, right, I think it just represents like how people react a little bit more. It's not all painted as negative, like, oh, let's ditch class, but there's people thinking about someone lost a life here. There's heaviness issue, and they took issue with that, which is great representation.
Yeah, a conscientious objector, and all the more that she's white, and
exactly,
that makes it a lot more interesting.
Right on, man.
So that protest does come out for what it is, right? It's just kind of a sham protest. Was there anything else beyond that, Vanessa, about the names of the characters before we get into the end of the novel?
Yeah, the protest.
Well, I have a couple more about DeVante.
Okay.
Well, and one about Khalil and DeVante. So it's like DeVante talking about Khalil on page 236.
Okay.
So Star is kind of questioning DeVante about Khalil. And she said, well, DeVante tells her that Khalil wasn't even a king lord. And then they kind of explain why he's represented in that way when it wasn't even true.
That's when King
puts the bandana.
Because he wanted to save face, right?
Exactly, yeah. That's what the line is. Literally, like, word for word. And then, so, yeah, it's just for King to have, like, this, I guess, more of a presence in the neighborhood. And then...
And then his mom, right? Right there on 237, about how his mom had stolen some stuff from King. And so Khalil was actually trying to protect his mom, by, I guess, falling on that grenade.
Right, which again, like, kind of shows a different side of his character that the media didn't portray, and that's part of Star's, frustration with the media portrayal. Whereas 115 gets like this, his father on TV, and images of him with his kids and his wife, fishing, his dog, right? These very, very, very polar opposites.
Yeah.
Representations. Anyway.
And which again is very much in line with what we see in a lot of these cases, where it's polarized like that, black and white in a both literal and metaphorical sense.
And then a little bit before that, I wanted to talk about on page 220 is when we actually see DeVante getting beat up in that same way that Seven is beat up. And Well, actually, he's not beat up. I'm totally mixing this up. Mr. Lewis is the one that gets beat up in this scene. And he's almost killed by the King Lords in order to protect DeVante as well, because he's on that same side as, like, we have to get these people, like, this community, we have to, like, clean this community out and make it more where we can grow. Like, they want to grow the community.
Yeah, which goes back to Tupac, right? And growing the rose that grew from concrete poem. That you have to start somewhere, right? You can't abandon your community. Is part of Tupac's philosophy that we had talked about in episode 2.
Yeah, which is why I think Maverick's decision to want to stay in the neighborhood is really important as well, and why his role as a father figure to several other characters plays a crucial role.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Was that it for DeVante and Khalil? Before we get to the talking a little bit about their names, yeah.
I think so.
So the names, we talked about a little bit in the first episode, but why are they important as the novel goes on? Like, why do they take on an importance?
What kind of defines who they are as characters? Kind of like back when we talked about the Poet X, how Xiomara finds out what the meaning of her name is, and she kind of starts to realize that that's who she is a warrior. Here in this book, they're actually named because of the meanings of the name. So we have Sekani, whose name means merriment and joy. And he kind of embodies this happiness wherever he goes, as dark as like the circumstances are, he kind of brings that happiness back into the family. And then you have Star, because she kind of saves Maverick, so she's this light that she brings into his life. She saves him. And then I'm going to go more specific into that one. Yeah. So she saves him because it's around the time where he's getting into jail, so he starts to try to change his life and turn it around because he has this daughter now that he wants to protect. And then you have 7, whose name means, it's a holy number and it means perfection. And I like the line that Maverick says. He says, "I ain't saying you're perfect. Nobody is. But you're the perfect gift God gave me." So I feel like that one's really important also. And then another one that I really found interesting was King. So his name is King, and he ends up becoming the King Lord in the gang. He's like the top guy.
Yeah.
Almost like King of the Jungle too, like the alpha, the one who like kind of controls things.
Right.
Yeah. Did you already mention Khalil?
I didn't. That's the one I forgot.
Oh, go ahead.
So Khalil actually means friend. And so that's really interesting, and how he's represented as a friend to Star.
Yeah. And yet tragic, that the lost friend, right? Just like Natasha. And Natasha is referenced in the film, but in the book, we get a little more insight into the another tragedy, right? So it's the first time that Star has witnessed something like this. And Star, I think, is also symbolic of, like, she becomes the star in the sense of, like, this kind of big investigation, and the media, the spotlight is on her. And so a lot of the novel is about something that we don't see much in the film, is the agony of, like, being on the spotlight for something you don't want to relive, right? Like, it's your best friend that you've grown up with, and you don't want to relive something like that. You don't want to reprocess that trauma, especially someone as like a teenager. And yet she realizes that she has to, and I think that's, again, just like Xiomara, finding her voice, finding her weapon. Just like for Xiomara, it's, her poetry. With Star, it's just using the megaphone. There's also on page, speaking of names, on 180, sorry, on 401, I was way off. Chris confronts him about their names too. And so he has a little argument with DeVante, um, and he says, why do some black people give their kids odd names? I mean, look at you guys' names. They're not normal. And then DeVante re- retorts, my name normal. I don't know what you're talking about. And so they go on about, you named after a number, what's your middle name? 8. And, and, they go on into, well, they're uncommon names. And 7, wisely replies, it's about perspective. Plus, most of the names white people think are unusual actually have meanings in various African languages, right? And that kind of goes into what you were saying, Vanessa, about the meaning behind the names, right? And not just going with whatever the popular name is for babies at the moment. And let's be real, some white people give their kids uncommon names too. So I thought it was an interesting way of kind of thinking about flipping the table, right? And how Chris kind of wants to make this about othering them just because they have, names that are what he finds unusual, and actually pointing it back to Chris and something that we see in the film where, Maverick confronts it, right? He says, like, what kind of plain ass name is that? So I think it kind of shows a side of the African American community that a lot of times is another reason why they get stereotyped into thinking that the names don't mean anything, or they're just like weird names or whatever, right? But they have a lot of meaning in them, especially, of course, in Angie Thomas's work. Mm-hmm. Besides the names, though, so we get the big decision that even though Starr did decide to testify in the grand jury and share her voice in that way, which is a very, of course, formal environment, we get the more informal environment later on, because ultimately the grand jury chooses not to indict through they find this out through the radio as Tupac is playing also, that not to indict Officer Brian Cruz Jr., as he's named in the book. Mm-hmm. And that, of course, has reverberations across the community, as you might imagine, because of all they have been through together, and all that they know about, the way that these lives do not seem to matter. So after that, of course, there's another protest that is very much the opposite of Williamson. And Vanessa, why did you find important about the protest itself, or what happens in it?
Well, this is where we finally see Starr actually, well, not finally. It's like the second time she's like standing up for Khalil. So things didn't go the way they should have in the trial, and the officer isn't indicted, right? So, but then we see her grab the megaphone, and it's pretty much play by play in the film and the novel. Like, they're pretty much the same thing. Mm-hmm.
Except that, and sorry to interrupt, but I think in the film, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Chris just he takes off, right? So Starr tells Chris that like it's too dangerous for him because he's white. But in the novel, I think Chris sticks around, if I'm not mistaken, to actually watch the protest and watch her, which I think is an interesting point, because it kind of shows that like he's willing to, expose himself and be part of this, express solidarity with Starr, because they did have, I mean, Chris, we haven't talked about much, but there was some tension about how he didn't really understand her perspective. And I think this is the moment where he finally does, choose out of his own free will, to actually take part of this, right? Even just witnessing Starr blossom right into this kind of powerful influential voice in the community.
But I think also why they changed it in the film is because it's not DeVante, it's Seven.
Mm-hmm.
So they also have Lyric and Kenya with them. In the novel, they don't.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why Star sends Chris away, is to take care of Kenya and Lyric.
Yeah, good point. And you were mentioning that this is all the second time where she finds her voice in that way. How does this then develop her as a character that's different from the first time? Like, what is it about that she does in the protest that you think is significant?
Well, in the first interview that she has, they blur out her face. So she's using her voice, but at the same time, a lot of people, even though a lot of people know who she is, there's a lot of people that aren't going to know who she is. Here at the protest, people are recording her regardless. People are standing there in the crowd and seeing her, and she's screaming at the top of her lungs. So I feel like this is more, it's a bigger step that she has to take because she's not hidden.
Yeah. And there's cops too. Like one of the things as we saw in the film, the cops ultimately threw out tear gas and, they tell them to disperse, right? Even though we should emphasize that under the Constitution, we have the right for peaceful assembly. And, of course, there's always going to be people who, end up using that right and abusing it. But here, I mean, it is a peaceful protest and a kind of vigil, right? That Ofra is there too, right, from Justice for Justice to kind of help her. And one of the lines that resonates for me from that scene, she says right before she Star kind of speaks to everyone and has her own chant. Ofra says, "Take your weapon," and of course the weapon ends up being the megaphone. So it's about how you can weaponize your language in a way that brings the community together, that helps them grieve, that helps them make sense of this injustice, yet another one to count, to add to the list, right? And that list that we do get at the end, and this is just my last strong line, is on 443, where she says, once upon a time, there was a hazel-eyed boy with dimples. I called him Khalil. The world called him a thug. He lived, but not nearly long enough, and for the rest of my life, I'll remember how he died. Fairy tale? No, but I'm not giving up on a bitter ending. It would be easy to quit if it was just about me, Khalil, that night, and the cup. It's about way more than that, though. It's about Seven, Sakani, Kenya, DeVante. It's also about Oscar, Ayana, Trayvon, Rikia, Michael, Eric, Tamir, John, Izel, Sandra, Freddie, Alton, Philando. It's even about that little boy in 1955 who nobody recognized at first. Emmett. The minister part? There are so many more. Yet I think it'll change one day. So I thought this was a very powerful way for Star to zoom out and think about, that, I mean, it's a really mature decision, right? To look beyond herself, look beyond her friend, and realize, he's not the first. And this has been going on for decades, even after the civil rights movement. And and of course, all of them have something in common. They're African-American boys and girls, and African-American men and women as well, in some cases. And just kind of adding Khalil to this kind of eulogized list, to me, was a very powerful moment that almost ends the novel. But that's what resonated with me, is her ability to kind of shine a light on all these names. And I think that, going back to what you were saying, Vanessa, about names, I think it's one more way to honor these people, and I'm riffing again, but it just reminds me of Walmart and how, there was 46 people who were shot, 22 who ultimately died. But I think it is important that even just saying their names is one way to honor them. because names have meanings, names have power. Just like the officer is reduced to just Officer 115, because of how he dehumanized Khalil. He so too, recoils on that and is therefore dehumanized, but because of what he did, right? And, it's the life for life kind of thing, and he still, of course, gets to keep his.
Yeah.
But right, right after that, um, what was your strong line, Vanessa, about the end of the novel?
It's the last 4 lines of the book. So it says, Khalil, I'll never forget. I'll never give up. I'll never be quiet. I promise. And so I like the third to last line. I'll never be quiet. So she's learned to use her voice, and now she's going to continue to use it in order to fight for what she thinks is right. And I feel like that, I just love that she found that for herself, and she's able to do that.
Her weapon, right?
Yes.
Pretty much laid out to you through the megaphone, and the importance of being able to recognize, right, all these names. Like, that's actually a good tie-in together, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, we can't be quiet. I mean, there's too many people, too many names to be. And that's even Angie Thomas in her own kind of breaking through, I feel, as a testament, of what's happening.
And not forgetting, because in the case of Emmett Till,
witness.
bearing witness, and in the case of Emmett Till, 1955, right? I mean, all of us here, I think it's fair to say, weren't even born back then. Well, I don't know about me, but that it just doesn't seem to stop, and there's a lot of frustration, there's a lot of rage, and reminds me of Dylan Thomas, right? Rage against the dying of the light, and it's the light that is Star, right? She's literally a light in this dark world that King exacerbated, but I think more systemically, right? Kind of thinking about what you were saying, Richie, about the systemic issues that these communities face. It's really the things that happened despite King, because King is kind of just there as an enforcer, but ultimately he right is rendered impotent at the end, because he is finally called out, right? Like, everyone ends up snitching on him, and snitching here has this negative connotation in general, but for them it's an act of bravery. And the fact that DeVante chooses to snitch, obviously not something that we see in the film, is to me just another way for DeVante as well to develop his own voice. And I will say, as we're finishing up this novel and thinking about the film and how much better the novel is than the film, I will say that Angie Thomas's second novel, On the Come Up, is a very interesting novel that I would recommend to everyone, because not only is it very similar in its themes, but it takes place in the same universe as The Hate You Give. So you have a main character who is reacting to what Star ended up doing, right? And so you see the ripple effect of what Star has decided to do and On the Come Up, except in that story, instead of someone who witnesses a shooting, it's about someone who takes on rap battles, right? Becomes a hip hopper and rapper, and uses that in a way similar to Xiomara.
Ultimately, right, you're kind of talking about the agency of voice, and we didn't talk about it a whole lot, but the whole Tupac thread that I talked about when we did the screening.
Yeah,
someone who really ties into that is Cornel West, and big American intellectual for a long time, since the publication of his book Race Matters in 1994, and a lot of people still reference it, but he talks a lot about Emmett Till, right? And he talks about how his mother specifically made it a point to have an open casket so people can see what they did to her son, and pretty much Cornel West echoes her words that there is no time to waste. It's precious. And so I think we get that sense of urgency here, even at the end in this protest, and through the anger, the frustration of Star's words, and memory of Khalil, right? That we do have to act because there is no time to waste.
Yeah. I think that's a good way to, close the book on this.
Thank you for joining us in our discussion on The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. Join us on our next episode as we discuss Everything Begins and Ends at the Kentucky Club by Ben Sines. And if you haven't read it, we hope we inspire you to pick up a copy. Follow us on Instagram at literallyliterary.ep.